I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this might be the perfect Skoda Octavia. When the new Skoda Octavia launched here in Australia earlier this year, it was initially available in three specifications: a base model Ambition, a mid-spec Style, and the top-of-the-range RS. What was missing was a true luxury-grade Octavia, and that's what I've brought along today. This is the new 2022 Octavia Limited Edition, or LE. And this spec is interesting for a lot of reasons. Firstly, when we get inside, you'll see it's really nicely appointed. And for about 50 grand, it feels like quite a complete car. The wagon is another $1,500 and is a no-brainer in my opinion because it looks better and it's even more practical. But it's actually what you can't see, what's under the skin, that makes the LE so fascinating. Because while the base model and Style Octavia get a 1.4 litre engine with a torque converter auto, kind of the second world specification for a Skoda powertrain, the Octavia LE gets the full-fat 2-litre EA888 petrol 4-cylinder engine, much like an RS, but detuned to 140 kilowatts of power. You do get a DSG automatic that works well in this car, plus you get multi-link independent rear suspension, whereas the base Octavias have always run on torsion beam rear suspension. So that makes this car good to drive. In today's video, we'll be doing just that. But before we drive the car, we'll look at the interior, the boot, and we'll discuss the running costs. Before we get started, hit subscribe. Jumping inside the Octavia LE, you find a really nicely resolved interior, to be honest. It isn't as afflicted as the new Volkswagen Golf with kind of over-technologizing everything, if that's a word. You still have some useful shortcut keys here down below the screen, and a big difference on the screen, which does share some components with the Volkswagen Golf Mark 8, is that we have this permanent bar that sits at the bottom of the touchscreen with climate control, temperature, seat heating and seat cooling. So those are the things that you have to sort of dig a little bit further down into menus in the Golf to access. But not just that, the screen itself is also just snappier than that of the Volkswagen. The menu structure feels more intuitive. I'm sure all of the fundamentals are actually the same. It just seems that Skoda's implementation is just a little bit better, and definitely there's an effect on snappiness. Also in front of the driver, every Octavia now has a digital instrument cluster. However, you'll want one with navigation so you can actually put a map there and really use it to full effect. But it looks good, the graphics are crisp, the definition is there, it's bright, and you can set it up exactly how you want with sort of modular left and right sides of the screen too. Now, one thing I will say is, being the 50 grand limited edition, I probably expected a slightly higher level of opulence. I mean, 50 grand is pricey, and at this kind of level, a Mazda 6 has Napa leather, it has real wood trim. Here in the Octavia, we've got this sort of denim up here on the dash, which definitely looks cool, but it just more says 40 grand than 50 grand to me. I don't know, I might be very much in the wrong on that. It's subjective, you can let me know down below. What I do like though is a little bit of chrome up here. We do have this sort of metal effect finish, it's not actually real metal. You got paddle shifters, and one thing I love that Skoda always does is this perforated steering wheel, which just looks and feels really expensive in the hand. Nice job. It's also a cool steering wheel on the Octavia with sort of gaps in the spokes. It all just looks and feels, you know, quite high technology, but also luxurious. Speaking of luxury, we have leather seats as standard on the LE. You can option them on the Style. They become standard here. They're perforated black leather with white contrast stitching. The driver's seat has memory and a thigh extender, but both the driver and the front passenger get seat adjustment, which is electric, and also heated and cooled front seats, which is great for Australia, and also great given black is the only choice. Unfortunately, beige, which Skoda used to offer on many of its luxury specs, is no longer available on the Octavia, and that would have just given this interior a bit more of a lift and made it feel a bit more like 50 grand. You also get a Canton stereo. It definitely needs some fine tuning, but once you've put that effort in, it sounds good. There's a wireless charger down here, 2 cup holders, adjustable armrest with a fair bit of storage, 2 USB-C ports up here, and big door bins that are flock lined. We get a bin over on the passenger side too. And in the glove box, that is also flock lined. something that you no longer get in the Golf Mark 8. So it's kind of strange positioning Golf and Octavia. Octavia always used to be the poor cousin, definitely no longer the case. The only thing you have to spend money on in terms of options is paint and sunroof, which this car doesn't have. One thing about the Skoda Octavia is that it's a really useful size. British publications in particular always say it's a rival to the Golf, Focus, Mazda 3. I don't actually think that's right. It's clearly a size class above. It's what Australia used to call medium cars. It's not really a segment of its own anymore because everybody has moved to SUVs, but it is truly medium. It sits between a Golf and a Passat if you're looking at the Volkswagen lineup. This is of course a Skoda, so it sits between the Fabia, or the Scala in fact, and the Superb. It's a good, useful size, and you can see that for me, as an adult sitting in the back, measuring 6 foot tall, I've got heaps of room. Headroom, loads of it. Legroom is great. Toe room is totally fine. You could fit someone in the middle at a pinch. The hump in the floor is kind of big, but as a nice sedan or wagon to take away to the country for a weekend with a couple of adult friends or taller kids, this is absolutely great. We also get a bunch of amenities. We get air vents. That's standard across the range. What the LE does is it introduces another climate zone, so you can choose your own temperature back here. Plus we've got heated seats in the back, always nice to have on a winter morning. We've got USB-C ports, and then a whole host of other Skoda special amenities. So mounted over here on the passenger seat, we have a phone or tablet holder, which is great. No need for expensive proprietary in-car infotainment for the rear passengers. Just a couple of these phone holder mounts will get the job done more cheaply and more effectively when people bring their own devices. We've got a phone holder in the back of the seat, map pockets in both seats. We have sun blinds here, which is great for keeping the sun off the face of little ones. There's another blind behind us too. Even though the window itself isn't massive, Skoda just decided not to let any pinch of light through there, which is great. But we do have hard trims here on the rear doors. So not any, very, very small problem really in the scheme of things, given how good this back seat is. Lastly, you do get an armrest here in the middle if you're using it as a 4-seater. We've got cup holders, and we have a pass-through to the boot. So, all pretty sorted. The Skoda Octavia is an interesting one in terms of body style choices. It kind of looks like a sedan. It's pretty much always looked like a sedan, but it's actually a liftback. That's what I've brought along today. Although I think the wagon, which is $1,500 more, makes even more sense. However, it's a clean design, although I'm not entirely sure it looks like 50 grand in fridge white from the back. However, you can get a bunch of more interesting colors for this car, including 2 really fetching grays, which will arrive by the end of the year, but there's also a red and a blue. Now, power tailgate, that's standard across the range, impressively, and it opens up to reveal a 600-litre boot, which is massive, bigger than most mid-size SUVs, showing that SUVs are not always more practical or bigger inside. As you can see, we've got all 3 of our suitcases in here with no problem. There's a bit of a step getting out of the boot, but the boot itself is clever. We've got this little holder thing here that you can drop groceries into. We've got pockets off to the left and right. We've got nets. We've got a boot protector, and then underneath that boot protector, we have our Space Saver Spare. So it's a pretty well kitted out boot. The load height is low, again, because it's not an SUV. Now, if you opt for the wagon, you get a 640-litre boot, so more space again. Remembering that boots are generally only measured to the window line. So if you get a wagon, you're also getting more vertical space. So it's not really just 40 litres bigger. It's quite considerably bigger again. Control there to quickly close the power tailgate, operates silently, not like a beeping one on a Toyota, for instance. And on that note, we can discuss our last point before taking a drive, running costs. Running costs on a Skoda are usually pretty low, and that's how it goes for the Octavia LE. Skoda Australia recently introduced a new 7-year service pack, which covers the first 7 services, their annual or every 15,000 Ks. And that 7-year pack, which you buy up front, costs $2,400. That makes this car attractively cheap to service. There's also a 5-year pack, which comes in at $1,550, or you can just pay for your services annually as normal. The warranty on the car is 5 years with unlimited kilometers, but if you buy one with the 7-year service pack, by the end of 2021, you actually get a 7-year warranty, which equals Kia as pretty much the best in this segment. Fuel consumption on the 140 TSI, we managed about 8 litres per 100 Ks, which is okay, nothing particularly exceptional. And lastly, insurance. In the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer spent $900 to comprehensively insure a new Skoda Octavia. Everybody's situation varies, and your premium will vary based on things insurers take into account, like where you live, your driving history, if the car is garaged, etc. So at the start of this video, I asked the question of whether this is the perfect Skoda Octavia. And of course, the natural answer to that is, well, the perfect Octavia is an Octavia RS wagon. And to be honest, I agree. The confounding point is that the latest RS, the 4th generation RS that I reviewed a few months ago, is pretty expensive now. They start at $53,990 drive away, but that's for a car with cloth seats and not too many fancy features. So once you've optioned it up to a reasonably kind of quietly sport luxe family wagon, you're looking down the barrel of like 60 grand. And I'm not saying that it isn't worth that, because I think the Octavia RS is a really good car. It's just that we need to acknowledge it's kind of pricey. Whereas this car, the Octavia LE, is $54,990 drive away for the hatch that I'm in now, and $51,990 drive away for the wagon. So, like, what do you lose? Well, I'm actually going to tell you, you don't lose that much compared to the RS. You're probably noticing that it doesn't have weird sound synthetically piped into the cabin. One of the only downsides to the new 4th generation RS is that every time you start the car, it's pumping in like this V8-esque soundtrack through the speakers, which you have to turn off through the screen every time, and that's tiresome. Because the E888 engine, just by itself, you know, let's listen. You know, it's not the nastiest sounding 4-cylinder in the world, it's perfectly fine. It kind of doesn't need a synthetic engine note because it's not offensive to start with. And of course, we get the 2-litre turbo from the RS here in the LE. It doesn't have as much power or torque. Where the RS has 180 kilowatts and 370 newton meters, the LE has 140 kilowatts of power and 320 newton meters. But that's still plenty in a car that only weighs 1,400 kilos. And that's actually for the wagon. So the liftback that we're sitting in here is even lighter. 140 kilowatts is still giving us over 100 kilowatts per ton. So it feels pretty sprightly. Partially also because, unlike the base Octavia and the style, we don't have the compromised solution Skoda Australia had to come to, teaming a 1.4 litre turbo with a new torque converter auto that isn't that well tuned. Instead, here we have the 2-litre turbo with the 7-speed wet clutch DSG, and it's all about that wet clutch. That's what transforms it from being slightly odd at low speeds in dry clutch form to really fluent and slick and quick shifting and intuitive all the time. A wet clutch DSG is a good DSG. So the engine and gearbox are pretty impressive in this car, and the whole thing's pretty sprightly because it's quite light. The wagon LE is just over 1,400 kilos. The liftback is even lighter than that. And so 140 kilowatts plus the 7-speed DSG's quick response times give this car a 0 to 100 time of 7.4 seconds, which is only 0.7 seconds behind an RS. And you might be thinking, well, surely it's got to be the chassis that distinguishes the two cars. And it is. The RS definitely has a harder edge. It can definitely stand up to a greater deal of punishment. But there's not that much between the cars, actually. They even wear exactly the same wheel and tyre package. With the RS, some are delivered on a more aggressive tyre. Here in the LE, we only have a Cincherato P7, but they still measure 225 wide at all 4 corners, and we've got 19s. There's definitely a softer tune to the suspension, but we have 2-stage adaptive dampers here in the LE. And like any car on Volkswagen's MQB Evo platform, or the MQB that came before that, it just has this kind of characteristic suppleness to it, but also characteristic control. And like even like a base model Golf or Octavia, it's just so chuckable in the corners. And that's part of what makes this car feel so polished to drive, is that if you want to drive it sedately, it's good at that. It's comfortable, it's quick enough. But if you do actually want to drive it in a spirited fashion, you realize, hey, this thing's got high limits. It's got excellent mechanical grip as opposed to chemical grip, which is a little so-so on the Cinturados. But the chassis just stands up to a punishment. And because we've got multi-link independent rear suspension in the LE rather than torsion beam that you get in the lower models, we just have better bandwidth for the rear suspension. It makes it comfier around town over speed bumps and things like that, where the torsion bar setup can tend to be a bit crashy in Volkswagen Group cars. But also when you are loaded up in a corner, the car strikes a bump, the rear suspension just has more that it can do to help you iron that out, whereas the torsion bar setup can feel a little bit jumpy as it just doesn't have as many options. Here in a properly set up, nice Octavia with the 2-litre turbo, the 7-speed DSG, and the multi-link independent rear, you really feel like, okay, I've graduated to quite a mature, sophisticated, near luxury car. So what are the alternatives? Well, you've got the Sonata N-Line, which is crazy overpowered for a front drive sedan with an open diff, but that's definitely an option if you want an even more design-led car. There's the Mazda 6. It's an old car now. It's 8 or 9 years old, but it still looks great. It's had a couple of facelifts. It's got the 2.5 turbo from the CX-9. Again, another powerful engine, front drive, open diff, but it comes together really well in the Mazda 6. And then there's stuff like a Toyota Camry or a Volkswagen Passat, and all of them are worth considering in their own way. But I actually think the Octavia is absolutely worthy of being close to the top of your consideration list, not just if you're looking for a mid-size sedan, but also if you're looking for a mid-size SUV. Throw this into the mix and just see what it can do, because the ride and handling is more resolved than just about any crossover. That's just a fact. Lastly, safety. We've got AEB, we've got adaptive cruise, we've got lane keep assist that's well tuned, we've got blind spot monitoring in this car, so it all feels pretty well kitted out. So that's the Skoda Octavia 140 TSI Limited Edition, a really fluent car. It just drives exactly how we want a European car to drive. It's got a punchy turbo engine. It has that super responsive DSG automatic that I still think is my preferred gearbox for this car. And the handling and the ride, you know, they just feel fluent is the word. It comes together really beautifully. It's a smooth car to drive, and that well-finished interior makes it feel worthy of the LE badge. However, 50 grand is a fair bit of money to spend on a Skoda Octavia. That being said, all cars are getting more expensive, and given the fact that it's about 10 grand less than an RS, spec for spec, is quite compelling to me, given how well this car drives. Keen to know your thoughts though? Let me know down below the video. Are you interested in Octavia LE? While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell, and as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.